Hello and welcome to Think Watercolour. This is a sketch of a woodland pathway in early autumn. It's a made-up image based on memories of many walks I've had in local woods and forests in Cheshire. I've tried to convey the idea of an early morning mist in the quiet of the forest. So let me talk you through how I did it. This is a sheet of Saunders Waterford 300 gram rough paper, and I've loosely sketched the image with the distant trees and the foreground trees in position, and loosely marked out where the pathway is, and the rest I'll just make up as I go along. So let's get started. Starting with the sky, I'm using a very watery mix of cerulean and cobalt blue and adding a touch of cobalt teal here and there. This is going to dry much lighter and it'll form the focal point of the painting. And I'm leaving a few white strips for some silver birch trees in the distance and the two trees in the foreground. If you're a beginner, start with the lightest light and work towards the darkest dark. Now this is not a rule, but just a good guide for getting started with watercolours. And always remember, when you're watching videos like this, watching is learning, but when you're doing, you're understanding. So the more you paint, the more you understand your colours. For the path, I'm using an initial wash of Naples yellow, and I'll be adding to this later on. And this is pyrrole orange, cadmium yellow and some sap green, just for where the foreground leaves are just changing to their autumnal colours. And I'll add a touch of jadeite green for some darker patches. These are all going to dry much lighter and I'll be adding to them later in the painting. As I say, I'm making this up as I go along, so I'm just blocking a few areas in where I want to see some foreground leaves turning to their autumn colours. My aim is to suggest early autumn where there's still a lot of green on the leaves, but some are already changing and falling. And do try to mix and mess about with your colours on your palette and see what you come up with. It's the best way to learn them. Just get a scrap piece of watercolour paper and try mixing, say, ultramarine and burnt sienna. You'll get a whole range of greys, but you can also make a really strong black. And the same with ultramarine and pyrrole orange. Those two combined will give you a whole range of autumn colours, if you like, and you can make a really strong black. And always remember, don't be precious with your fresh sheet of paper. Just be bold and go for it. And while the paper's still wet, I can add some of these darker touches. As I said before, it's all going to dry much lighter, and I'll be adding some more darks to it in the next layer. Here I'm just using a rigger to pick up the tooth of the paper to create some textured areas using burnt sienna and some Van Dyke brown. I'm just going to switch to a larger brush for the foreground area of the pathway. You'll see a little bit more detail once this is finished, but at this stage it's just a background wash just to pick up the texture of the paper, as I said before. Now this is the really ugly stage of the painting where you wonder if it's ever going to work out, but when you're painting like this, just keep going. Once you start adding the darkest darks, the painting will come together. But as I say, at this stage it looks pretty ugly. For the foreground trees, I'm using fairly strong mix of Van Dyke brown with a tiny amount of ultramarine added to darken it. Just blending the roots of the tree trunk into the ground there, just hinting at some of the upper branches, leaving some gaps. The left-hand tree I see as a silver birch, so I'm just indicating some darker patches of bark on the white of the tree trunk. And again, just blending the root or the base of the tree trunk into the ground there with some jadeite green. And using a mixture of Van Dyke brown and some burnt sienna, I'm just trying to indicate a little bit of detail in the foreground with the leaves on the ground. These colours look nice and bright when you put them down, but they will dry flatter and duller. And I'll be probably adding to this a bit later on. But as you get further away from the viewer's eye, the leaves on the ground become less distinct, so you can soften the edges a little bit more. Just blend it all in. I'll wait and see how this dries before I make any decision whether to add any more to it. Just putting some fairly strong jadeite green in to just lift out some of the foreground leaves, and dropping in some pyrrole orange to suggest the leaves changing colour in the foreground here. These are branches in my mind that are just hanging over the to the left, just to create a little bit of depth in the painting. Again, these autumnal colours will dry a little bit flatter, so I will, towards the end of the painting, I will add some stronger mix of paint to just bring them forward a little bit. Just defining those distant birch trees, just indicating a little bit of the darker patches of bark on the side of the trees. They're a long way away, and I just wanted to suggest that depth. And that's his aerial perspective, where further away it's much lighter, and as you get closer to the viewer's eye, the painting becomes darker and stronger. And the pathway has these two leading lines leading the eye into the painting to the focal point, which is that group of distant birch trees. Just adding a little bit more colour to the distant leaves on the trees, just to bring them forward a little bit from the background sky and misty wash. Again, these will dry much lighter. Just starting to darken up the foreground now with some jadeite green, some burnt sienna, all mixed together, whatever's in the palette really, just thickening the mix up so that it's not quite so watery. Just creating some depth in the shadows on the leaves in the foreground trees. Do have a go at something like this yourself if you're a painter watching this. It's all good practice, and working from your imagination is not such a bad thing. Just try and remember a scene that you know pretty well, and see if you can capture it on paper. Just lifting out that little bit of dark there, it just drew the eye to it too much. Just dropping in some cadmium yellow into the trees to mix in with the green that's already there, just to create this variety of green where it's getting lighter and going yellow and then brown and then it becomes golden. Don't be too carried away by painting too much detail when you're doing this sort of sketch. Just keep it very loose and very simple. At the end of the day, it's just a bit of fun with some coloured water and some paper. So don't beat yourself up if it goes wrong for you. You can nearly always find a way of changing things and correcting things. Just putting in a few branches in these overhanging leaves in the foreground. Same on the right, just a few indications of some branches hanging into the painted area. Just darkening a few areas on the ground there, just to give it a little bit more definition and bring it forward to the viewer's eye. Again, it's creating that aerial perspective. You work from the lightest light to the darkest dark and create depth in your painting that way. Just adding a few more darker details in the to the leaves on the ground there. Just try and bring that forward a little bit. A few more darker patches in the trees, just to suggest some shaded areas. Trick when you're painting something from your imagination, just step back and think for a second about how the painting's looking, and if you feel you need it, add some darker touches. What I'm doing now is I'm adding some pretty neat cadmium yellow almost out of the tube and some pyrrole orange, just to suggest these foreground leaves and bring them really close to us. Never be frightened to use fairly neat paint when you're doing stuff like this. You could use some gouache, but I prefer to use watercolour paints and straight out of the tube, unless I'm painting white, in which case I will use gouache. But it just lifts the painting a little bit in the foreground. These will dry a little bit flatter, but they'll still retain a lot of their colour because it's fairly neat pigment. And I think I'm pretty much done. I hope you found this useful. Basically, it was all about creating something from imagination and memory, really. Just to suggest a nice walk on an autumn morning with the early morning mist in the background. Do give it a like if you found it useful. Always helps with YouTube. Do subscribe if you're not a subscriber and hit the notification bell for future videos. And thank you once again for watching.